Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you
Hi there, and welcome to Self-Inflicted Aural Nostalgia, the Guided by Voices podcast, every GBV LP, every 2 weeks. My name is Jeff Gomez, and in this episode, I'll be looking at Devil Between My Toes. But first, let me say that all music heard in this podcast is played and owned by Guided by Voices unless otherwise stated. Also, any reviews and materials cited are owned by their respective creators. A special thanks goes out to Jeff Warren's Guided by Voices database, which you can find at gbvdb.com. And of course, all opinions stated are my own. You can also subscribe for future episodes at everygbvlp.com. And finally, if you'd like to drop me a line, you can do so by sending an email to jeff@everygbvlp.com. Now let's get to the show. Okay, we're going to start at the very beginning and work forward in chronological order. And first up is GBV's debut, 1987's Devil Between My Toes. It's incredible to think, but that was over 30 years ago now. It's amazing to me that GBV has been around that long, and the fact that they're still so good and really have never been better is why I like them so much. And that's what led me to do this podcast, to make sure some of these earlier records or some later gems weren't overlooked, or, at the very least, that people knew more about the background of how they were made. So, as I mentioned, this is GBV's debut LP, but it's not the first thing they recorded and released. That honor goes to 1986's EP, Forever Since Breakfast. GBV turned to recording after they'd stopped playing out, not that they played too many shows, but the ones they did play weren't very well received. Pollard has said that the band was basically too weird for Dayton, and so instead of trying to gain a local or even a national following by playing around town or touring, which would have been hard given the fact that Pollard had a family and a career, they decided to become a studio band and just make records. Something else that helped with the decision to record instead of be a live band was that there wasn't a coherent or consistent lineup during this period. A few of the guys from the so-called classic lineup were around or involved, but there was no real or solid band. For example, Tobin Sprite is listed as being with the band, but he wasn't yet in Pollard's inner loop. He was still focusing on his own band, Figure 4. The most interesting thing that came out for me in listening to this again was that it sounded a lot different than I remembered. Early GBV is usually compared to REM. It's kind of all you hear about, that Guided by Voices was an REM clone or copycat. But I hear more of a post-punk influence than REM. And that's a sound no one else was really minding in 1987. Basically, GBV was more original right out of the gate than they've been given credit for. Not that they had everything figured out in terms of the way they would sound or with their song structures, but everything you like about GBV was present, even on this first record. It's also the first record that Pollard was happy with. He was disappointed with the sound of Forever Since Breakfast, but on Devil Between My Toes he was starting to achieve what he was hearing in his head. Now, the original title of the record was The Future Isn't Eggs. The title that was eventually chosen comes from the rooster that's seen on the cover. The rooster's name was Big Daddy. Pollard had bought the rooster for his son Brian, but when the rooster started misbehaving, he gave it to his neighbor, an old woman named Nana. This is when he was living on Titus. The rooster continued to bother Pollard. In the GBV biography Hunting Accidents, Pollard's mentioned calling the cops on the rooster, and the title came from that. Pollard was being pecked and he said, "I've got a devil between my toes." The cover, a black and white photo of Big Daddy, was originally going to be an artwork done by a high school friend. It was going to be of a cockfight with a bunch of weird people in the audience, but Pollard couldn't locate the guy to draw it, so instead he settled on Mitchell taking a picture of Big Daddy. The picture's kind of blurry because he was taken through a chain-link fence and the rooster was trying to attack Mitch when he took it. The same rooster comes up later in Don't Stop Now, a song from 1996's Under the Bushes, Under the Stars, when Pollard writes, "Woke up one morning, saw a rooster strutting by my house." And in the next verse, Pollard references the rooster directly, asking, "What keeps Big Daddy happy?" This is only slightly different from the Devil Between My Toes subtitle, which is printed right on the cover of the record, and it says, "What makes Big Daddy happy?" This is a great example of the Robert Pollard universe, or Pollardverse, if you will. Song fragments or titles appear and reappear throughout their career, and this is something you see across their entire discography. The cover also has a drawing, but it may have been cut out of something and just pasted on. It isn't credited on the sleeve. And not counting the compilation record King Shit and the Golden Boys that was part of the Scat box set in 1995, Devil Between My Toes is the only GBV cover that's just in black and white. The back cover features an illustration of a guy pulling a mule. It's not a Pollard collage, but it has a sort of 50s textbook vibe, like the boxers on the back of Propeller. I'm not sure of its significance. Maybe Pollard thought that the man's struggle was what he was feeling as he tried to make a go of being in a band, or making music, or making it as a musician. Or maybe he just liked it as a diagram. Either way, the GBV visual aesthetic was beginning to be formed. In terms of when the record was released, that's pretty easy to tell since it's printed right on the cover, February 15th, 1987. That being said, what does that date even mean, and when's the last time you saw a record's release date or any kind of date on the cover? I looked it up, and February 15th in 1987 was a Sunday. This is odd since records aren't released on Sundays. They used to be released on Tuesdays, and now they're released on Fridays. So did they pick this date just for fun? Is there some personal significance? I'm not really sure. Also, what does released even mean when talking about these early records? Nothing was truly released until Scat came along in '93 and released the Grand Hour EP and Vampire on Titus. So I don't know how these records even got into people's hands, if they did at all. Pollard mentions only one person, his assistant principal, buying the record and liking it. So where was it for sale? Was it on consignment somewhere? A few local record stores? Did they have some kind of distribution? They weren't playing shows during this time, so I don't know how or where any copies of this would have been on sale. In talking about the musical context in which Devil Between My Toes appeared, let's look at what was happening in college rock in 1987. College rock is what you would have called GBV at this stage, or at least what they were aspiring to be. According to the website Slicing Up Eyeballs, which bills itself as the legacy of 80s college rock, the top 5 records of 1987 were The Cure's Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Depeche Mode's Music for the Masses, The Smiths' Strange Ways, Here We Come, R.E.M's Document, and U2's The Joshua Tree. Yes, U2 was once considered college rock. They were even, if you go back far enough, considered Christian rock. What's interesting is that Devil Between My Toes doesn't match up to any of those bands except possibly R.E.M. This shows that Pollard, for most of his career, has existed outside of any sort of popular scene or contemporary influence. Even later on, where they were lumped in with lo-fi bands or even the indie rock scene in general, Pollard and Guided by Voices had their own sound and aesthetic that was all their own. In terms of their record label at the time, Devil came out on Schwa Records. Schwa is a phonetic term. It's that upside down and backwards E you find in dictionaries. For example, it signifies the sound of A in alone and sofa. Now, at that time there had already been a Schwa Records, run out of Chicago. They released punk records in the early 80s and put out a cassette as late as 1985. The logo is different from what's on the GBV record. This makes me wonder, did Pollard know about the punk label? Was he repeating what he did with Forever Since Breakfast, where he slapped an I Wanna Records label on his own record even though they weren't really on the label? I doubt it. Instead, Pollard probably just heard of a Schwa and liked it, and so used it as a name. And it's such a good name for a label that, earlier this decade, it was revived yet again as Schwa with an exclamation point, which was listed as a free MP3 download net label. Devil Between My Toes was released on vinyl only, and each of its 2 sides had names instead of just being labeled A and B or 1 and 2. The sides are named Buckeye and Briar. I've seen this before. For example, Joy Division's Unknown Pleasures' 2 sides were labeled Outside and Inside. And, of course, one of Pollard's favorite bands, R.E.M., did things like this. For the 1986 record Life's Rich Pageant, it had a dinner side and a supper side instead of just A and B. In a CD and digital world, naming sides doesn't happen, since sides no longer exist. But Pollard, having grown up in the 70s, would have been aware of bands doing things like this, not to mention sequencing records into 2 distinct parts. And, for the record, a buckeye is a North American tree or shrub related to the horse chestnut. It's also the state tree and the mascot of Ohio State University, and a briar is a prickly plant or shrub. In terms of who played on the record, as I mentioned before, there wasn't really a coherent band at the time. Tobin Sprout is listed as being with the band, and he plays a little guitar and adds some backing vocals, but he's not yet contributing songs or even just recording them. Mitch Mitchell, the guitarist from the so-called classic lineup, is here playing bass instead of guitar. Drumming was split between Kevin Fennell and Peyton Eric. Kevin would later go on to form the classic lineup along with Mitch, Tobin, and bassist Greg Dumas. But for the next couple of GBV records, there would be different drummers with almost every record. Mitch and Kevin were guys Pollard knew from the neighborhood. They all went to Northridge High together, but both of them are a bit younger than Bob. Bob was born in 1957, but Mitch and Kevin were born in 1959. By the way, Mitch's birthday is on Christmas and Bob's is on Halloween. The three were in a variety of bands together with different names until Bob settled on Guided by Voices in the early 80s. Most of the guitar on this record is by Bob, which is really rare on later releases. Pollard's younger brother, Jim, also played guitar on the record. He also has 4 co-writing credits, and Mitch has 2. Jim's the youngest of the Pollard kids. They also have older sisters. Jim was an amazing athlete, same as Bob. In fact, he was a legend around Northridge, referred to only as the Man. He averaged 36 points a game his senior year of high school, and he holds the Dayton area single-game scoring record with 57 points. Many people felt he was good enough and was destined to play in the NBA. He was such a big deal that, when he got into college on a basketball scholarship, it was reported in the Washington Post. In a 1980 article entitled "College Recruiters Look to Next Year," John Feinstein wrote, "Arizona State signed an excellent guard in 6'2" Jim Pollard from Dayton, Ohio." However, after being plagued by a series of injuries at Arizona State, he dropped out of college and returned to Dayton in 1982. This was probably a pretty humbling and disappointing experience for Jim, but big brother Bob warmly greeted his sibling by saying, "You're in Guided by Voices now," even though there really was no steady group or lineup at the time. Being able to concentrate and contribute to GBV must have taken some of the sting out of the disappointment of college and the failure to have a career in sports. In fact, Bob's relationship with Jim is pretty amazing, and their support of each other over time is really heartwarming, especially when contrasted against the brothers you usually find in rock and roll. Like, think of the Jesus and Mary chain, or Oasis, or the Kinks, where the brothers can't stand each other. In terms of where Bob was in 1987, he would have been 30 years old. He was a 4th grade school teacher, had been married for years, had 2 kids, and owned a house. I'll talk more in later episodes about the struggle he felt as a family man and a musician, as people got more and more fed up with his quote-unquote hobby. But suffice to say that a lot of people around him thought that this wasn't what he should have been doing at this point in his life. When the band finally broke in 93 and 94, people would think Pollard was really old, but 30 is already a bit late to think you're going to make it as a rock star. When you think of young bands and scenes, it's kids in their 20s. It's the Strokes looking cool on the Lower East Side of New York, hanging out with models. Or it's the Beatles in Hamburg. But you don't really think of 30-year-old guys who have 2 kids and are married, much less who are school teachers. Later, this would prove an irresistible angle for journalists and is one of the reasons for why GBV broke so big. But at this point, it was just another thing standing in Pollard's way. By comparison, Michael Stipe from R.E.M., a band we know Pollard liked and admired, was 3 years younger than Pollard. In 1987, he was 27 and his band already had 5 LPs out. By the time Stipe was 30, R.E.M. would be one of the biggest bands in the world. And by the time the guys in the Beatles were 30, the band had already broken up, so Pollard had a lot of catching up to do. Devil Between My Toes was mostly recorded at Steve Wilbur's 8-track studio. It was right around the corner from where Pollard was living at the time. The studio was in Wilbur's garage and he charged $15 an hour. Forever Since Breakfast had been recorded in Kentucky for about $300 a night. And Wilbur is, of course, the first name of one of the Wright brothers who were from Dayton. One song, the first one, was recorded in the Snake Pit, Pollard's basement. This would lead the way for many more basement recordings and was a peek at what was to come for Guided by Voices. In terms of who produced the record, the sleeve says it's produced by Bob, with Bob in all caps. How does it sound? Well, like it was recorded in a garage on 8-track. That's not to say that it sounds bad, because a lot of GBV isn't hi-fi, obviously, but Devil lacks a certain charm of the later recordings. One interesting thing is the way that Pollard sang on the record. The English accent hasn't yet shown up. Instead, he's singing in a much more straightforward way. There's no real affectation yet in his voice. In terms of the songs, there are 14 of them, with the LP clocking in at 31 minutes. Of everything on the record, Captain's Dead is probably the most widely heard because it's on 2003's GBV Best Of, Human Amusements at Hourly Rates. It's a good song, but it's not my favorite. It does have the line, "We'll ride to the heart of the sun," which is probably a reference to Pink Floyd's 1969 song, "Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun," from A Saucer Full of Secrets. This is interesting because in 1987, on the college rock scene, no one was really mining those 60s influences. Remember that punk was all about getting rid of big bands like Pink Floyd. The Elephant Six scene later got sort of prog or psych with bands like Olivia Tremor Control, but with this reference, Pollard's showing his age and his influences, but in a good way. The record opens up with a song called Old Battery. This is the one song on the record that was recorded in Pollard's basement. It makes real thematic or contextual sense that the first song in the first GBV LP is a basement recording, since that would form so much of the GBV aesthetic over the next 30 years. His voice in this song actually reminds me of Devo, that is, Gerald Casal singing, not Mark Mothersbaugh. Think of something like the song Beautiful World. Pollard has talked a lot about his love of Devo, and that influence is something you hear a bit in GBV. It's something that becomes really apparent when you listen to something like his side project, Circus Devils, especially with the videos. In Hunting Accidents, Bob says that Old Battery is about mortality, and was inspired partly by his grandmother at the time. It's about how people find religion late in life, just in case. He also mentions that he played the song for Tobin Sprout, and Tobin asked him to immediately play it again. It was also the first song where he was happy with the recording. He also seems to imply that the chorus, Die Hard, was inspired by the movie. The next song is Discussing Wallace Chambers. Wallace Chambers was a football player, a defensive tackle. He played for the Bears and then the Buccaneers in the 70s. For college, he went to Eastern Kentucky University, and since Kentucky is just south of Ohio, and Pollard played sports growing up, it makes sense he'd know who Chambers was. The song also mentions someone named Broderick Lewis, but I'm not sure who that is. This is another song that reminds me of Devo, especially the background vocals. There are 5 instrumentals on the record. These are sketches mostly. In terms of their sound, Art Boat has almost a Throbbing Gristle or Einstürzende Neubauten kind of vibe. It's puzzling to me why Pollard would include instrumentals, not to mention so many of them. Sandbox would be recorded that same year, so he presumably had the songs written and ready to go. Plus, he must also have had a backlog of songs. This is the guy, after all, with a suitcase full of songs. So why have nearly a third of their debut record be instrumentals? I'm not really sure. Probably the most interesting song on the record is A Portrait Destroyed by Fire.
And the neon wet concrete, a well-worn path, a smothering heat, a curious pet in an open cage, subjected to his master's rage. Oh.
It's very post-punk in the opening. It almost reminds me sort of Joy Division or early Cure. But the background vocals on the verses make it sound sort of prog. It's the longest song on the record at 5 minutes and 10 seconds. It also shows that their early sound is not just R.E.M. Bob's always been vocal about his love of the English band Wire, so some of that shows up on this record. Some of the instrumentals have this feel too, especially A 3-Year-Old Man. Lyrically, Bob has said that this song is about spousal abuse, yelling and hitting and that sort of thing. The line, "Rings of gold and rings of blue," he writes, "those are bruises. This harkens back to a song I really love on the Forever Since Breakfast EP, the last song, The Other Place, where he writes, "A little boy stepping in front of his mom when his dad starts to beat her." That's pretty heavy stuff, and the same as what he's writing about here, or in the song Every Day from their next record. It's kitchen sink kind of drama, or realism. It's stuff he really didn't deal with after these first couple of records. He also says that when he was being interviewed to be a teacher in Dayton, the principal asked him what he would do if a student came to him and said they were being raped by their father. And Pollard answered that, being from Northridge, quote, "we're used to that sort of thing," unquote. So you have to wonder if he really witnessed some of these things, either in his own life or with his friends, whether the reality around him was so tough or depressing that he sought refuge in his later poetic and surrealistic lyrics, and that he chose that route just because writing about what he saw around him was too depressing. Hey Hey Spaceman is a fun song. It's very jaunty in an Echo Smyron sort of way. The way Pollard sings the words is a lot of fun and shows the side of GBV that most people know and love. I'm not sure if the Jimmy being referenced is Pollard's brother, but it probably is since Jim has 4 co-writes on the record and was a big part of the band during his early years. The Tumblers is a nice, sleepy song. This song has some interesting effects that sound to my ear sort of like a Martin Hannett production. The drums have no cymbals, it's just the toms. This shows that GBV wasn't always just going for a big rock sound. Instead, a lot of what they did tried to sound like the late 70s and not just the late 60s. Hank's Little Fingers is my favorite song on the record. This is about a guy he knew named Hank who had a birth defect. He had little fingers on his right hand, and he played guitar by attaching a pick to his hand with a rubber band. The fact that he was really good and didn't let his hand stop him inspired Bob to learn and play guitar, not to mention write the song. But it's also about paying respects to people that Pollard knew at the time and knew growing up in rural Ohio. Songs like Redmen and Their Wives were about rednecks and growing up in Northridge, which Pollard calls a kind of Appalachian community. And he knew how people in the rest of Ohio looked at rednecks, not to mention how the rest of the country looked at them. Think of a song like The Big Country by Talking Heads, where he says, looking out the window of a plane, "It's not even worth talking about people down there." It's that classic flyover state mentality. But Pollard defends these people singing, "Unless you got the answers, don't patronize the mountain man." According to the Guided by Voices database, this song was never played live, which is a shame, but there's a great cover of the song on YouTube by a guy who looks like Steve Wozniak. In terms of what people thought about Devil, I couldn't find any contemporary reviews. Most people wouldn't hear this record until the Scat reissue in 1995, but since then, here's what some people have said. Rock Robot's Guide to GBV says, "Chances are, if you're a fan of GBV, it's not because of this album." And Brian Egan, in a 3.5-star review on AllMusic, writes that Devil Between My Toes foreshadows the brilliant records to come. There were no singles or videos for the record. It's on Spotify and you can buy MP3s from Amazon and iTunes. The German label Get Happy re-released it in 1993 with a Sperm A cover, at least I think that's what that is. This is the same company who put out the An Earful o' Wax compilation in 93. Otherwise, it's part of Scat's box set from 1995, which is out of print, but there are both vinyl and CD copies on Discogs. In terms of some final thoughts, Devil Between My Toes is not at all a bad record. Sure, it's not classic GBV, but it's probably better than you remember, or if you haven't heard it, definitely give it a spin, it'll be worth it. Okay, in the next episode, I'll be talking about GBV's second LP, Sandbox, which was also recorded and released in 1987. Pollard called it overproduced, so you don't want to miss it. Until then, subscribe to the show, leave a review, and God bless the Monument Club.